There's something magical about the quiet hours of the night, when the world slows down and stories come alive in the flicker of candlelight. Can you picture it? A lone figure bent over an ancient parchment, her fingers tracing faded ink as the firelight dances across the page. That's where our tale begins tonight, with Alara, a young elven scholar whose curiosity is about to lead her on a journey far beyond the safety of Rivendell's archives. And to you, listening now, we'd love to know where in the world are you joining us from tonight? What hour has your clock struck as you settle into this story? Let us know in the comments below, because every great adventure is better when shared. Alara's discovery tonight is no ordinary map. It's a relic of forgotten times, whispering secrets about the legendary Flame of Anor, a fire said to burn not with heat, but with boundless wisdom. Legends claim it was hidden centuries ago, tucked away in the most perilous place imaginable, the heart of Mount Doom itself. Just imagine standing where she stands now, the weight of that knowledge settling over you. The choice to pursue it isn't just about bravery, it's about answering a call that tugs at something deeper, the kind of call that changes everything. As she packs her satchel with quills, herbs, and a single silver vial of starlight gifts from her people, Alara can't shake the feeling that this quest will demand more than she's ready to give. But isn't that the way of all great journeys? They begin with a step into the unknown, a breath held between fear and wonder. And tonight, you're invited to walk beside her through every trial, every revelation, as the firelight of her courage lights the way. So lean in, close your eyes, and let the story carry you. The path ahead is steep, the shadows long, but oh, the wonders waiting in the dark. The library's candles flickered as Lord Elrond's voice dropped to a whisper, his hands tightening around the age-worn table between them. Some knowledge comes at too high a price. Alara, he murmured, the weight of centuries heavy in his gaze. The Flame of Anor was hidden for a reason. But her fingers only clenched tighter around the map's edges, parchment crinkling like distant thunder. She'd spent her life chasing echoes of the past. How could she turn away now when the truth felt so close? Outside, the wind hissed through the valley, carrying with it the scent of pine and something sharper, something restless. His final warning followed her to the gates, a plea woven with the names of those who'd sought the flame before and vanished without trace. Yet when the bridge of Rivendell groaned beneath her boots, Alara didn't look back. Not when the first howl split the dusk, not when the trees ahead seemed to lean closer, their branches knitting together like barred teeth. The wilds had always been a place of wonder in her books, but tonight, the stories felt different. The rustle of leaves might have been the wind. The scrape of talons on stone might have been her own pulse roaring in her ears. She walked until the stars sharpened overhead, until the ache in her legs drowned out the doubt gnawing at her ribs, and then silence. The forest held its breath. Even the fireflies dimmed as if something ancient had turned its attention toward her. That was when she heard it, a whisper, not in the air, but in her bones, humming the same 3 notes over and over. A lullaby, a warning. The flame was calling, and though every instinct told her to run, Alara took another step forward, because some answers are worth stepping into the dark to find. The forest floor crunched softly under Alara's boots as she knelt beside the moss-covered stone, her fingers brushing away centuries of dirt to reveal markings older than Rivendell itself. The runes glowed faintly, as if stirred by her touch, a language of sharp angles and curling flames, warning of what lay ahead. She traced the symbols with a scholar's care, her breath catching as the pieces locked together in her mind. Beware the keeper of the pass, whose breath is embers, whose sleep is shallow. A fire drake, not just a creature of legend, but a sentinel left to guard the mountain's secrets. The wind shifted then, carrying the scent of charred wood and something metallic, like a sword left too long in the forge. Her eyes darted upward, scanning the tree line for movement, but the forest held its breath. Time pressed against her ribs. Every moment spent deciphering the runes was a moment closer to dawn, when the drake might stir. She could almost hear Lord Elrond's voice in the rustling leaves. Wisdom isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to move with it. Alara slipped the map back into her satchel, her mind racing. A direct path was suicide, but the mountains were riddled with forgotten ways, tunnels carved by dwarves, hidden passes known only to the eagles. Her fingers closed around the silver vial of starlight, its cool weight a reminder of her people's gifts. If the drake feared anything, it was the light of the heavens, but to use it now would be to reveal herself too soon. A snap of twigs sent her heart into her throat. She froze, listening as the sound echoed, too deliberate to be an animal. Someone, or something, was tracking her. The runes had spoken of a guardian, but what if the real danger wasn't the drake at all? The forest seemed to tighten around her, shadows pooling like ink. Every choice carried weight. Every step could be her last. Then, a glint. A sliver of moonlight, catching on something metallic, wedged between the roots of an ancient oak. A dagger, its blade etched with the same runes as the stone. A tool or a test. Alara exhaled slowly. The path forward wasn't just hidden, it was waiting to be chosen. And as her hand closed around the hilt, she knew some doors only open when you're brave enough to knock. The dagger's hilt felt unnaturally warm in Alara's grip, as if it pulsed with a heartbeat of its own. She barely had time to tuck it into her belt before a guttural cry split the night. Close, too close. The orcs had picked up her trail. Her breath came in sharp bursts as she wove through the trees, the undergrowth tearing at her cloak. Then the ground gave way beneath her. She tumbled down a rocky slope, the world spinning until her back slammed against a fallen log. Pain flared through her ribs, but worse was the sound of heavy footsteps above. Clutching the dagger, she pressed into the shadows, waiting for the end. Instead, a strangled gasp echoed through the trees, followed by the sickening thud of a body hitting the earth. Silence, then labored breathing, not orcish, human, cautious as a fox. Alara crept forward until the moonlight revealed him. A man slumped against a boulder, his leather armor slick with blood. One hand clutched a snapped arrow shaft, protruding from his shoulder. The other gripped a sword stained black. His eyes flew open as she approached, blade rising weakly. "Stay back," he rasped, but the wound told the truth. He wouldn't last till dawn. Alara hesitated. Rangers were known to roam these lands, but trust was a currency more precious than mithril. Yet when his fingers slackened and his head lolled, something in her stirred. She knelt, pulling herbs from her satchel. "This will hurt," she warned, snapping the arrowhead free. His scream sent birds scattering from the branches overhead. By the time the poultice was applied, the ranger's face had gone ashen. "Torin," he muttered when she asked his name. His voice was rough, but his gaze cleared as it landed on the rune-etched dagger at her hip. "You seek the flame," a statement, not a question. When she nodded, he gave a bitter laugh. "Then we're both fools." His story spilled out between gritted teeth. A village ravaged by blight, fields that yielded only dust no matter how fiercely the sun shone. Elders whispered of a curse, of earth poisoned by some long-forgotten malice. The flame's light could purify it, Torin said, his fingers trembling around a pendant carved with wheat stalks, his people's symbol. Not for power, for life. Dawn tinged the sky when the first orc horn sounded in the distance. Torin staggered to his feet, swaying but resolute. "They'll keep coming," he said, offering his sword arm as balance when Alara's ankle twisted on the uneven ground. An unspoken pact passed between them then. Two strangers, one path. The dagger at her side hummed softly, as if in approval. Some alliances aren't chosen. They are forged in the quiet, understanding that some burdens are too heavy to carry alone. The cave mouth yawned before them like a silent scream, its jagged teeth of stone slick with condensation. Alara pressed a finger to her lips as the warg's snuffling breaths echoed outside, too near, too eager. Torin's shoulder brushed hers as they edged backward into the gloom, every footfall careful as a thief's. The air thickened with the scent of damp earth and something older, something that clung to the back of Alara's throat like a half-remembered nightmare. Moonlight barely reached the first twist of the tunnel, but as their eyes adjusted, the walls came alive, not with moss or lichen, but with carvings and deep, frantic grooves that told stories without words. A handprint here, fingers splayed in terror. A figure there, arms raised not in triumph but surrender, its mouth open in a soundless wail. Alara's pulse hammered against her ribs as she traced a particular scene. A robed form, kneeling before a pillar of fire, its outline blurring at the edges as if the stone itself couldn't bear to capture what came next. Torin's breath hitched beside her. They weren't just seekers, he murmured, his calloused thumb brushing over a cluster of tally marks. They were warnings. The unspoken question hung between them. How many had come before? How many had been swallowed by the very thing they sought? A draft slithered through the passage, carrying with it the faintest hum, 3 notes, the same haunting refrain Alara had heard in the forest. Torin stiffened. "You hear it too," she whispered, not a question. His nod was barely perceptible in the dark. "Every night since I left my village," he admitted, his voice raw. "Like it's digging under my skin." The confession cracked something open between them. Here, in the belly of the earth, pretenses crumbled like old mortar. Alara's fingers found the dagger's hilt, its warmth a small comfort. "My people say the flame reveals truth," she said slowly. "But what if the truth is that we're not strong enough?" The words tasted bitter. Scholars' hands weren't made for holding flames. They were made for turning pages, for preserving stories, not living them. Torin's laugh was a harsh thing, bouncing off the narrow walls. "Strength's got nothing to do with it," he said, nodding at the carvings. "Look at them." Warriors, mages probably had more courage in their pinky than I've got in my whole body. He flexed his injured arm, wincing. "It's not about being unafraid. It's about what you do with the fear." A growl reverberated through the tunnel, closer than before. Wargs didn't fear the dark. Alara's grip tightened on the dagger as she peered into the blackness ahead. The carvings seemed to lean in, their hollow eyes following. Every legend spoke of the flame's glory, but these walls whispered of its cost, of minds unraveled by too much knowing, of hearts turned to ash in its presence. Torin nudged her elbow, pointing to a narrow fissure barely visible behind a curtain of stalactites. Deeper or out, he mouthed. Outside meant teeth and claws. Inside meant stepping into the very shadows that had swallowed so many others. Alara hesitated only a heartbeat. Some choices weren't choices at all. As they squeezed through the crack, the cave exhaled around them, its breath laced with the scent of charred parchment and old iron. The humming grew louder, threading through the rock like veins of gold. Neither spoke of the way their hands trembled. Some silences were louder than words. The air outside the cave hit them like a furnace blast, thick with sulfur and the acrid tang of charred stone. The fire drake loomed before them, its scales glinting like molten copper in the dying light, each breath sending embers skittering across the cracked earth. Its tail lashed, carving deep grooves into the rock, a living barrier between them and the mountain's throat. Torin's fingers twitched toward his quiver before Alara caught his wrist. "Wait," she mouthed, her eyes locked on the creature's slit pupils. They weren't the mindless orbs of a beast, but something sharper, older, a sentry, not a monster. Torin hesitated, then nodded, knocking an arrow with practiced ease. Not to kill, to sing. The bowstring thrummed, and the shaft buried itself in the drake's flank, not deep enough to wound, but enough to sting. The creature reared back with a roar that shook loose pebbles from the cliffs. Its massive head swung toward Torin, jaws parting to reveal a throat glowing like a forge. Alara's voice cut through the heat-hazed air then, soft but unshakable, weaving an elven hymn older than the mountain itself. The words were meant for starlit groves and quiet rivers, not this hellscape of fire and stone, yet they curled around the drake like morning mist. Its muscles tensed, flames guttering in its chest as the melody wound deeper. Alara stepped forward, her palms upturned, no weapons, no threats, just the offering of a memory. The drake's nostrils flared, catching the scent of her, parchment and sage, the crispness of a first frost. Something in its gaze flickered, recognition. Loneliness, centuries of guarding a thing no living creature should touch. The moment stretched, brittle as thin ice. Then, with a shudder that sent tremors through the ground, the drake shifted. Not retreating, but yielding. A single clawed foot lifted, clearing a path just wide enough for them to pass. Torin exhaled sharply, his shoulder brushing Alara's as they edged past the creature's bulk. Heat radiated from its scales, close enough to blister skin. One misstep, one falter in the hymn, and those jaws could snap shut like a landslide. They didn't run when the path cleared. Running would have been an insult. Alara let the last note fade naturally, bowing her head slightly, a scholar's respect for another keeper of secrets. The drake's answering rumble might have been gratitude. Or warning. The relief was short-lived. With every step upward, the mountain pressed down, its heat a living thing that slithered into their lungs and weighted their boots. Torin's breath came in ragged gulps, his bandages dark with fresh sweat. Alara's fingers trembled as she uncorked her vial of starlight, tipping a single drop onto his tongue. "Save the rest," he croaked, but she ignored him, daubing the liquid along her own brow. The coolness was fleeting, a blink of respite in an ocean of fire. Above them, the summit yawned, its jagged rim haloed in shimmering waves of heat. The path narrowed to a treacherous spine of rock, sheer drops gaping on either side. No carvings here, no warnings, just the raw, brutal indifference of a mountain that had swallowed fools for ages. Alara's foot skidded on loose scree, sending pebbles skittering into the abyss. Torin's hand shot out, steadying her, his grip firm despite the fatigue etched into every line of his face. Neither spoke of the doubt, thickening the air between them. The flame was close now. They could feel it in the way their bones hummed, in the way their shadows stretched unnaturally long against the rock, as if something far older than sunlight shaped them. Victory had seemed possible in the drake's shadow. Here, at the edge of the world, it tasted like ash. The ground beneath their feet hissed like a living thing, radiating heat through the soles of their boots, as the entrance to Mount Doom sealed behind them with a groan of shifting stone. Elara unfurled her map with trembling hands, only to watch in dismay as the ink blurred not from sweat, but from the parchment itself curling at the edges, its carefully drawn lines melting into meaningless smudges. "It's rewriting itself," she whispered, the realization colder than the mountain was hot. Torin snatched it from her grip, his jaw tight as he turned the disintegrating page toward the sickly orange light, filtering through cracks in the cavern walls. "Some guide," he muttered, tossing it aside where it blackened and crumbled to ash before hitting the ground. The labyrinth was alive, not with creatures, but with the mountain's own Malice tunnels twisting back on themselves, stalactites dripping molten rock like venom, and worst of all, a whisper that wasn't quite sound. It slithered into their thoughts, needling at old wounds. Torin's fingers twitched toward his sword as the air thickened between them. "We're wasting time," he snapped, gesturing to a fork ahead where twin passages gaped like open jaws. "You take the left, I'll go right." Elara's hand closed around his forearm, her grip firm despite the blisters rising on her palms. No, the word wasn't pleading. It was steel. "This place wants us divided. Can't you feel it?" She pressed her other palm to the shuddering wall, where the rock pulsed like a fevered heartbeat. "The flame isn't just hidden. It's guarded by doubt. By every moment we've ever questioned ourselves." A tremor ripped through the cavern then, violent enough to send them both sprawling. Torin's elbow cracked against stone as the ground split open mere inches from his boots, revealing a chasm that exhaled a gust of scorching air. Alara lunged, catching his wrist just as the ledge beneath him crumbled. For one suspended heartbeat, they hung there, her muscles screaming, his weight threatening to drag them both into the abyss, until he scrabbled back onto solid ground, chest heaving. Silence settled between them, heavier than the mountain's weight. Torin wiped soot from his brow with a shaky hand, his voice rough when he finally spoke. "You're right, a concession, not just about the path, but about something deeper." He nodded toward the left tunnel, where the air shimmered slightly less violently. Together, then, the walls seemed to recoil as they moved forward, the whispers fading to a resentful hum. Alara's fingers brushed the dagger at her hip, its warmth a quiet counterpoint to the oppressive heat. Some trials weren't meant to be survived alone, and as the tunnel widened into a cavern, so vast its ceiling vanished into darkness, she understood. The real maze hadn't been carved in stone. It was the one they'd carried inside themselves all along. The pedestal glowed like a captured sunrise, its light pulsing in time with Alara's heartbeat as she stepped closer. The Flame of Anor wasn't fire at all. It was liquid light, swirling in a basin of blackened stone, whispering promises in a language older than words. Her fingertips hovered above it, close enough to feel the warmth lick her skin, and then the world fractured. Vision slammed into her like a tidal wave, stars birthing and dying in the span of a breath. Libraries vast as cities with shelves that rearranged themselves as she reached for a tome. The scent of her mother's hair unraveling into smoke the moment she tried to grasp it. Knowledge endless and weightless poured into her, but with each drop, something else dissolved. Rivendell's spires blurred. The sound of her own name slipped away. She was becoming everything and nothing, a vessel overflowing until even the vessel ceased to matter. Torin's voice tore through the haze, raw with panic. Alara, his call was an anchor, yanking her back just as her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the scorched stone, gasping, her palms scraping against the ground, as if to prove it was real. The flame's whispers still coiled at the edges of her mind, sweet as poisoned honey. It takes, she choked out. For every answer it gives, it steals a piece of you. Torin hauled her upright, his grip unyielding. His eyes flicked to the flame, then away, as if even glancing at it risked infection. "That's not wisdom," he growled. "That's a trap." The pedestal shuddered, cracks spider, webbing across its surface, and suddenly the truth was there between them, ugly and undeniable. The flame wasn't a gift to be claimed. It was a mirror, reflecting back the hunger of whoever reached for it. Alara's hands trembled not from fear, but from the awful understanding settling in her bones. She'd spent her life chasing secrets, believing knowledge was a torch to hold high, but this was a fire that burned the hand that fed it. Torin's village flashed in her mind, the blighted fields, the children with hollow cheeks. Had the others who came here seen their own desperate hopes twisted against them? The cavern groaned, pebbles raining from above. The mountain knew they'd refused its offering. The ground split with a sound like 1,000 books, slamming shut at once, the pedestal crumbling into the abyss below, taking the flame with it. Torin caught Alara's wrist as she swayed at the edge, his other hand braced against a jagged outcrop. "We have to move," he shouted over the roar of collapsing stone. But for a heartbeat, she hesitated, staring into the darkness where the flame had been. Not all treasures were meant to be kept. Some existed only to reveal what you were willing to lose. The answer, when it came, was simple. Not this. Not the weight of Torin's hand in hers. Not the memories that had woven her into a person who could walk away. The path out was no less treacherous than the one in, but their steps were lighter now, their shoulders brushing in the closed tunnel. The mountain's wrath faded behind them, its fury spent. Above, through a fissure in the rock, a single star winked into views, small, ordinary, and more precious than all the flame's hollow promises. Alara tilted her face toward it, breathing deep. Some light was meant to be carried inside you, not clutched in your hands. The mountain screamed around them, its ancient bones grinding as the cavern walls shuddered and split. Torin's grip on Alara's arm was iron tight, his voice raw against the roar of falling stone. "We have to go, now," but her feet stayed rooted, her gaze locked on the pedestal where the flame still swirled, its light flickering like a dying heartbeat. Every instinct as a scholar screamed at her to reach out, to seize just one drop of its wisdom before it vanished forever. Yet beneath that hunger coiled a darker truth. The flame wasn't merely fading. It was unraveling, and the mountain with it. Torin yanked her backward as a boulder smashed where she'd stood, spraying shards of blackened rock. Your people's stories never end like this. He barked, his eyes wild with a fear she'd never seen in him before. Not for himself, but for her. The realization struck like a physical blow. This wasn't just about survival. It was about what they'd carry out of these ruins, or what they'd bury here. Alara's fingers found the dagger at her hip, its runes humming against her palm, as if sensing her resolve. The pedestal was already cracking, veins of molten gold spider webbing across its surface. One strike would shatter it. One choice would erase centuries of knowledge. Her breath came shallow, the weight of generations pressing down. All the seekers who'd come before, all the voices that would never be heard. But then Torin's hand brushed hers rough and steady, and she understood. Some legacies weren't written in flame. They were etched in the spaces between heartbeats, in the quiet acts that no song would ever capture. The dagger fell. The sound was neither crash nor whisper, but something in between, a release, as if the mountain itself had been holding its breath. Light erupted, then collapsed inward, snuffing out like a candle plunged into water. Darkness swallowed the cavern, thick and suffocating, but Torin's voice cut through it, close beside her ear. Move, they ran as the world came apart behind them, each step a gamble against the crumbling earth. Alara's lungs burned, her thoughts strangely clear amid the chaos. She'd spent her life chasing answers, but here, in the dust and the deafening roar, she found something sharper, the certainty that not all wisdom was meant to be kept. Some truths were too heavy to carry. Some fires were meant to die. The tunnel mouth appeared like a mirage, a sliver of gray dawn ahead. They stumbled into the open air, just as the mountain's throat sealed shut with a final, thunderous groan. The ground stilled. The wind returned, cool and sweet with the scent of distant rain. Torin sagged against a boulder, his laughter hoarse with disbelief. You really did it. Alara flexed her empty hands, watching the first rays of sunlight gild the peaks above. The ache in her chest wasn't regret. It was something quieter, softer. The quiet after a storm, the hush of a story finding its end. She turned to Torin, his face streaked with soot and sweat, and found him already looking back. No words were needed. The real treasure hadn't been left behind in the dark. It was here, in the way his shoulder pressed against hers as they walked away, two shadows merging into one against the rising sun. The ground heaved beneath them as they ran, each step sending shockwaves through the trembling rock. Molten rivers snarled at their heels, close enough for Alara to feel the sear of heat through her boots. Torin's hand clamped around her wrist, yanking her sideways as a gout of flame erupted where she'd been, a near miss that left the air stinking of singed leather. Faster, he barked, though his voice barely carried over the mountain's death throes. Their lungs burned, their muscles screamed. The tunnel ceiling rained fist-sized stones, one glancing off Alara's shoulder hard enough to leave her vision swimming. She stumbled, knees buckling, but Torin was there, hauling her upright with a grunt. No time for pain, no time for fear, just the desperate rhythm of footfalls and the narrowing strip of daylight ahead, a promise shrinking with every heartbeat. Then came the sound no traveler ever wants to hear, the groan of collapsing stone. The entrance shuddered, its archway crumbling inward like a mouth snapping shut. Torin didn't hesitate. He shoved Alara forward with all his strength, sending her sprawling onto sun-warmed grass, just as the world behind them exploded in a storm of dust and debris. The impact knocked the breath from her body, but she twisted onto her back in time to see Torin leap. His silhouette framed against the falling rock, arms outstretched, forever caught between darkness and light. For one terrible second, she thought the mountain had claimed him. Then his fingers closed around her ankle, his body half buried in rubble but alive, so alive as he dragged himself free. They lay there gasping, the ground still trembling beneath them, watching as the last vestiges of the tunnel sealed with a final, thunderous sigh. Silence settled like a shroud. Not the oppressive quiet of the caverns, but something softer, sweeter. The hush of a storm passed. Alara rolled onto her side, her ribs protesting, to find Torin already looking at her. His face was a mess of soot and blood, one eye swollen shut, but his grin was brighter than the flame had ever been. "Told you we'd make it," he croaked. The absurdity of it hit her like a wave. A laugh bubbled up, raw and half hysterical, and then they were both shaking with it, their mingled voices echoing across the empty plains. No treasure, no glory, just two fools lying in the dirt, giddy with the sheer, improbable fact of their own breathing. Alara sat up slowly, wincing as her muscles protested. The mountain loomed behind them, its peak smoking faintly against the dawn. No one would ever walk those paths again. No one would kneel before that pedestal. The thought should have ached like a missing limb, but instead, something unknotted in her chest. She flexed her fingers, marveling at their emptiness. Torin's shoulder bumped hers as he pushed to his feet, offering a hand. His palm was calloused and streaked with ash, but his grip was steady. "Come on," he said, nodding eastward where the first true rays of sunlight painted the grass gold. "I know a place where the ale's cheap, and the beds don't try to kill you." Alara took one last look at the sealed mountain, then let him pull her up. The weight of the journey settled over them, not as a burden, but as a cloak, something to wrap around themselves when the nights grew cold. Some stories didn't end with crowns or conquests. Some ended with blistered feet and shared silence, with the quiet understanding that the real magic had been in the walking, not the destination. She shouldered her pack, falling into step beside him. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in what felt like forever, it was wide enough for two. The path back to Rivendell unfurled like a forgotten song, familiar, yet changed. Every rock and twisted root carrying new meaning under the morning sun. Alara's boots scuffed the same earth she'd trodden weeks before, but the woman who'd first set out with a scholar's hunger now walked lighter, her satchel empty of relics, but full of something quieter. More enduring, Torin matched her stride, his shoulder no longer hunched under the weight of his village's despair. The blight hadn't vanished, not yet, but something in the set of his jaw spoke of a different kind of hope. "Funny," he murmured, nudging a pebble with his boot. "We went looking for a miracle, and all we got was each other." His laugh was rough but real, echoing off the canyon walls. Alara tilted her face to the sky, where clouds drifted like lazy thoughts. The archives of Rivendell held thousands of tales about heroes who'd seized glory, but none about those who'd walked away. Yet here, in the dappled shade of an ordinary oak, she understood the secret those stories missed. Sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was turn their back on the light that called them. The mountain's whispers still lingered at the edges of her mind, but they no longer tugged, just murmured occasionally, like an old teacher whose lessons had finally sunk in. A rustle in the undergrowth made them both freeze, hands flying to absent weapons, but it was only a fox, its copper coat glowing as it darted across their path, pausing just long enough to fix them with a knowing glance. Torin exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Even the wildlife's laughing at us now. By the time the first elven towers gleamed in the distance, the land itself seemed to sigh around them. Streams ran clearer, their music sweeter. Wildflowers nodded in hues Alara couldn't remember seeing before. Whether the change was in the world or their own eyes, she couldn't say, and perhaps it didn't matter. Lord Elrond awaited them at the bridge, his robes stirring in the breeze. His gaze swept over their battered clothes, their soot-streaked faces, then settled on the space where Alara's dagger should have been. A slow smile softened his features. "You found it, then." Alara touched her empty belt, her throat tight, and left it. For the first time in memory, the Lord of Rivendell looked not at a student, but an equal. "Then you've brought back more than all who came before you." Behind him, the archive's doors stood open, their shelves waiting, but Alara's feet stayed, rooted to the earth. Some stories weren't meant to be shelved. Some were meant to be lived one dusty, sunlit step at a time. Torin cleared his throat, shifting his weight. "About that ale I mentioned." Alara's laughter rang out, bright as the new morning, and together they crossed into the city, leaving the mountain's shadow behind for good. The first warning came not with war horns, but with the absence of birdsong. Alara paused mid-step on the forest trail, her hand flying up to halt Torin behind her. The usual chatter of finches and thrushes had vanished, leaving only the whisper of leaves, too quiet, too careful. Then the wind shifted, carrying the stench of unwashed hides and rancid meat. "Orcs." Torin's fingers closed around his sword hilt before she could speak, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Scouts," he murmured, barely louder than a breath. Alara shook her head, pointing to the disturbed earth near a gnarled oak. Dozens of bootprints, fresh enough that the crushed ferns hadn't yet sprung back. "A warband, and they are heading toward the mountain pass." The implications settled between them like falling ash. That pass led to 3 undefended villages, their people still rebuilding after last winter's blight. They moved as one, slipping back toward Rivendell, with the grim efficiency of soldiers who'd learned the hard way that speed meant survival. The elven guards at the gates took one look at their faces and ushered them straight to Lord Elrond's council chamber. Maps already littered the table, weighted down by daggers and goblets, as if the lords had anticipated this moment. Elrond's voice was calm, but his knuckles whitened around the edge of the parchment. 500, perhaps more. They move under cover of darkness. Torin leaned over the map, tracing a route with a callous finger. Here, the old watchtower at Ambience. It's crumbling, but the foundation's sound. "We could funnel them into the valley below." His gaze flicked to Alara, a silent question in the set of his jaw. She understood. This wasn't just strategy, it was reckoning. The orcs wouldn't stop at burning crops. They'd erase every fragile hope these lands had nurtured since the mountain's fall. Her fingers brushed the empty space at her belt, where the dagger once hung. Some battles couldn't be won with relics or flame. By dawn, riders galloped to every village within a day's march. Farmers traded plows for spears. Shepherds taught their children to light signal fires. In the smithy's glow, Alara watched Torin demonstrate sword grips to a group of wide-eyed teenagers, his patience unshaken even when their hands trembled. "Steady," he said, adjusting a boy's stance. "Fear's just the weight of something worth protecting." The words settled in her chest like kindling catching spark. This was the truth the flame had never offered. That courage wasn't found in ancient power, but in the dirt-streaked faces of those who chose to stand together. As the first watchfires bloomed on the hillsides, Alara pressed her palm to the cool stone of Rivendell's walls, breathing in the scent of pine and forge smoke. Let the orcs come. They'd find no easy prey here, only hands joined, blades raised, and a quiet, unbreakable resolve to meet the dark head-on. The rocky spires of Muil loomed like broken teeth against the storm-churned sky, their jagged ridges casting shadows that seemed to writhe with every gust of wind. Alara crouched behind an outcrop, her fingers tracing the ancient fissures in the stone, not random cracks, but the work of dwarven miners centuries past. "There," she whispered, pointing to a narrow defile hidden between two sheer cliffs. "They'll expect us to hold the high ground. Let them climb." Torin's knuckles whitened around his bowstring, but his nod was firm. The plan was madness, and that was precisely why it might work. Horns shattered the twilight as the orc vanguard surged upward, their crude armor clattering like bones. Alara's makeshift army, farmers with hunting spears, elven scouts with notched blades, even a handful of gray-bearded dwarves who'd emerged from their mountains at the first whisper of war, held their breath behind crumbling barricades. Every rustle of chainmail, every stifled cough sounded deafening in the lull. Then came the signal, a single arrow, fletched with raven feathers, arcing high over the enemy ranks. Torin's shot. Chaos erupted. The orcs' left flank collapsed into the hidden defile as planned, their howls turning to confusion as the ground gave way beneath them. But the right flank adapted too quickly, their war chief bellowing orders in guttural black speech. Alara's stomach dropped. They'd underestimated the enemy's discipline. Torin moved like shadow given purpose, his arrows finding throats and eye sockets with terrifying precision. Yet for every orc that fell, two more scrambled over the bodies of their kin. A spearman to Alara's right went down gurgling, his blood soaking into the thirsty stone. She lunged forward without thinking, her borrowed sword flashing in a clumsy parry, too slow. The orc's axe was already descending when Torin's arrow took it through the wrist. The tide turned at Moonrise. Alara, pressed against the cliff face with her blade trembling in her grip, suddenly remembered a scrap of lore from Rivendell's archives. Muil stones remembered water. She slammed her palm against the rock and sang not a battle hymn, but the aching, wordless melody elves used to call spring rains. For 3 heartbeats, nothing. Then the mountain answered. A subterranean stream, dormant for ages, burst through the fractured stone at the orc's feet. Not a flood, just enough to turn dust to slurry beneath their boots. The war chief's snarl became a shriek as he slid backward into his own ranks, toppling them like dominions. Torin's archers found their marks. The dwarves' hammers rose and fell like thunder. Dawn stained the battlefield in shades of copper and rust when the last orc fled. The survivors, too few, far too few, leaned on each other, their cheers hoarse with exhaustion. A farmer's son, barely 15, pressed a water skin into Alara's blistered hands. You knew, he breathed, eyes wide with something dangerously close to reverence. You knew the mountain would fight with us. She shook her head, nodding toward Torin as he helped a wounded elf to sit. We only gave it the chance. The real lesson hummed beneath her ribs, quieter than the mountain's voice, but just as sure. Victory wasn't carved by heroes with shining blades. It was scraped together by cobblers and shepherds, by every trembling hand that refused to let go. Torin limped to her side, his quiver empty, his tunic stiff with dried blood. Together they watched the survivors tend, their wounded on the broken hillside, their shadows long and weary in the newborn light. No songs would be sung of this battle, not properly, not the way bards preferred, but the wind carried something better as it swept across a min mule, the sound of laughter, fragile and bright, rising from those who'd never expected to see another sunrise. The battlefield smelled of rain, soaked earth and crushed yarrow, the herbal tang doing little to mask the deeper stench of iron and smoke. Alara knelt beside a young dwarf whose beard was still patchy with adolescence, her fingers deft as they peeled back blood-caked fabric to reveal the gash beneath. The boy didn't whimper. Dwarves never did, but his breath hitched when she poured distilled maruver over the wound. Burns worse than dragon fire, he rasped, and Alara's laugh surprised them both, a fragile sound in the heavy air. Torin moved through the makeshift infirmary like a man who'd finally found his compass, handing out water skins and tightening bandages with hands that had once known only how to break things. His voice was softer now, the edges worn smooth by exhaustion and something like grace. When an elderly villager pressed a carved talisman into his palm, a crude likeness of the sun, he didn't refuse it. Just tucked it carefully into his pocket, where it rested against the wheat stalk pendant from his dead village. Some losses never healed. Some didn't need to. They buried the fallen at dusk, the pyres burning low to avoid drawing scavengers. No grand speeches were given. The wind carried away the words anyway. But when a mother placed her child's toy sword atop a soldier's cairn, Torin knelt beside her, his own blade unsheathed, and laid crosswise over the stones. A warrior's tribute, a promise. Alara watched the flames reflect in his eyes and understood, with sudden clarity, that this was what the Flame of Anor could never have shown them. True power wasn't in dominion, but in the quiet act of kneeling when you'd rather stand. Later, when the last embers faded to ash, they stood at the edge of camp, shoulders brushing. The stars here were different than in Rivendell, sharper, hungrier. We won't stop them all, Torin said at last, his voice rough with smoke and unshed tears. Alara tilted her face to the sky, feeling the weight of his honesty settle between them. No lies, no platitudes, just the truth, hard as mountain rock. She reached for his hand, her fingers threading through his without hesitation. No, she agreed. But we'll be there for the ones that matter. And when the first owl called from the darkened trees, its cry like a question thrown at the night, neither flinched. Some battles were fought with steel, others were won simply by standing shoulder to shoulder in the silence, two shadows merging against the coming dawn. The gates of Rivendell shimmered like mirages in the afternoon light, their intricate carvings worn smooth by centuries of returning feet, but never Alara's. Not like this. Cheers rose from the gathered elves as she crossed the bridge, their voices weaving through the waterfalls in a melody that made her throat tighten. Flowers rained down, catching in her tangled hair, their petals too bright against her soot-stained cloak. She wanted to shrink beneath the weight of their admiration, to explain that heroes didn't stumble out of mountains empty-handed, that true leaders wouldn't have let so many fall at a Min Muil. Lord Elrond stepped forward, his robes whispering against the sun-warmed stone, and cupped her face in hands that had shaped kingdoms. "Look at you," he murmured, thumbs brushing the dirt from her cheeks. Not "look what you've brought," not "look what you've done," just "look at you." The distinction cracked something open in her chest. Behind him, the archive's great doors stood ajar, their shelves whispering of knowledge she'd once thought held all life's answers. Now she understood. Wisdom wasn't found in ink, but in the calluses on Torin's palms as he gripped his sword, in the way a dying dwarf had laughed through bloodied teeth. The feast that night was a living tapestry of firelight and song, the hall alive with tales already growing taller with each retelling. Alara picked at her plate, the flavors dull on her tongue, until a warm presence settled beside her. Torin, scrubbed clean of battle's grime, his borrowed elven tunic sitting awkwardly on his broad shoulders. "They've offered me a ranger's cloak," he said, swirling his wine without drinking. His voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes flicked to the eastern windows toward the wilds, toward home. Alara understood then what the songs would never capture, that victory didn't straighten spines or smooth scars. It lived in the quiet moments, in the way Torin's fingers now traced the rim of his goblet instead of clutching a blade, in the space between their shoulders that needed no words to feel like sanctuary. The minstrels sang of dragon fire, defying courage, but the real story hummed beneath the table where her knee brushed his, a secret even the Flame of Anor couldn't have illuminated. Some homecomings weren't about fanfare. They were about learning to sit still in your own skin, about finding the ones who'd sit beside you in the unheroic silence afterward. Across the hall, Lord Elrond raised his glass, his smile holding all the pride of a father who'd watched his child outgrow the pages of his books. Alara lifted her own cup, the honeyed wine catching the light like liquid gold. Not a tribute to glory, but a toast to the messy, magnificent truth. Sometimes the bravest thing you could do was come home and let yourself be seen not as a legend, but as someone still learning how to rise. The first autumn leaves crunched underfoot as Alara knelt by the riverbank, her quill hovering above a fresh page of parchment. The inkwell beside her caught the sunlight, glinting like a tiny pool of midnight. Across the fire's embers, Torin adjusted the straps of his pack, his movements deliberate, a ranger's habit, always ready to move. "You'll write it all, then?" he asked, nodding at her half-filled journal. "Even the parts where we nearly got roasted by that drake." Alara's smile was fleeting, her fingers brushing the scar on her palm where the dagger's hilt had burned her. "Especially those parts," she said softly. "Stories aren't worth telling if they're missing the moments we'd rather forget." The truth settled between them like the river's murmur. Some wounds stayed tender long after the bleeding stopped, and that was exactly why they mattered. Torin rose, slinging his bow across his back with a practiced twist. The southern borders wouldn't scout themselves. and the rumors of unrest near Gondor's foothills had grown too loud to ignore. He hesitated, then tossed her a small leather pouch. Inside, a single arrowhead gleamed, the one she'd pulled from his shoulder in the forest. "For luck," he said, as if the word didn't catch in his throat. She tucked it into her sleeve, the metal cool against her wrist. Neither spoke of the unspoken fear, that the roads they walked now were darker, that promises made at daybreak could unravel by dusk. But when Torin turned to go, Alara called after him, her voice steady. "Look for me when the willow buds bloom. A simple thing, a season's turn, enough of a compass to guide them back." The distance grew between them with each step, Torin's silhouette shrinking against the gold-streaked hills. Alara dipped her quill again, the ink flowing as easily as the river at her feet. She wrote not of grand destinies or unbreakable vows, but of the quiet spaces between battles, of shared silence, and the way a campfire's glow could make even the loneliest night feel like home. Somewhere to the south, Torin paused atop a ridge, his hand straying to the sun talisman in his pocket. The wind carried the faintest echo of a melody, an elven tune, perhaps, or just the sigh of the pines. He didn't glance back, didn't need to. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in his life, it didn't feel like walking away. It felt like circling. And high above them both, the willow trees swayed, their bare branches whispering of the green they'd wear when winter passed. The years had painted silver into Torin's temples and calluses over Alara's once nimble fingers, but time couldn't dull the way her breath caught when the raven landed on her windowsill at dawn. Its beak parted, dropping not a scroll, but a single arrowhead, the one she'd given him all those winters ago, its edges now worn smooth by relentless travel. No words were needed. The darkness in the east had been a whisper for years, a rumor that slithered through taverns and market squares, but the weight of that little metal shard in her palm turned whispers into thunder. She found him where she knew she would, atop the cliffs of Erd Lithui, where the wind howled like a thing alive, and the horizon blurred into a smudge of storm clouds. Torin stood motionless, his cloak snapping behind him like a battle standard, his face older, but his stance unchanged. That same stubborn tilt to his chin, as if daring the world to try knocking him down. Without turning, he held out his hand. Nestled in his palm lay a willow bud, pale green and impossibly tender against his scarred skin. "They bloomed early this year," was all he said. The silence between them wasn't the quiet of strangers or even old friends, but something deeper, the hush of two people who'd memorized each other's scars. Below them, the land rolled eastward, toward shadows that thickened with every passing day. Villages had gone silent. Travelers spoke of crops withering overnight, of children dreaming the same nightmare. The flame of Anor was dust, but this new terror didn't burn. It gnawed, patient as rot. Torin's fingers closed around the bud, his gaze never leaving the horizon. "They're calling it the Hollowing," he murmured, as if the land's forgetting itself. His voice was rougher now, frayed by years of shouting over battlefields, but the steel beneath it was familiar. Alara touched the arrowhead at her throat, its edges biting into her skin, just enough to remind her she was awake. They'd walked away from one legend. This time, they wouldn't have the luxury. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp earth and something colder, something that made the hairs on her arms rise. Torin turned then, his eyes reflecting not fear, but a grim sort of recognition, the look of a man who'd spent years running toward fires instead of from them. Alara shouldered her pack, its weight heavier with age but lighter with purpose. Some roads didn't need speeches or promises. They only needed footsteps, side by side, and the unspoken understanding that this was why they'd survived the mountain, the war, the years apart. To stand here now, while the world frayed at the edges, Torin adjusted his sword belt, the leather creaking softly. "You still sing to rocks, scholar?" he asked, the ghost of a smirk tugging at his mouth. Alara flexed her hands, the old scars stretching. "Only when they listen," she replied, and when he laughed, a rough, warm sound that defied the gathering dark. She knew some flames never really died. They just waited for the right wind to fan them back to life. The first drops of rain struck their faces as they stepped onto the eastern path, the storm at their backs and the unknown ahead. Legends would call it courage later, if they lived, but in that moment, it was simply this: two sets of footprints in the mud, already filling with water, already fading. Moving forward anyway, the fire crackled low in the hearth of the golden hall, its embers painting the faces of children, wide-eyed in the flickering light. An old bard plucked the strings of his harp, but it was the weathered ranger in the corner who held their gaze, his cloak still bearing the singe marks of dragon fire, his fingers tracing the notches on an arrowhead as he began to speak. "You've heard songs of the Flame of Anor," he murmured, "but the bards never tell how cold the mountain was when we walked away. Generations would whisper of Alara's sacrifice, of Torin's steadfast grip, pulling her back from the abyss. Yet in the quiet hours, when the ale was poured and the stars pressed close, the real story emerged not in grand declarations, but in the spaces between words. How Torin kept a willow bud pressed in the pages of his journal long after it crumbled to dust. How Alara's maps, once filled with cryptic runes, began to mark the locations of orphanages and healed farmlands instead of ancient relics. The flame had seared away their illusions, leaving something simpler and far more enduring, the understanding that light wasn't meant to be clutched in greedy hands, but scattered like seeds in broken soil. Even in Gondor's white towers, where scribes recorded histories with gold-leafed precision, the tale grew wilder with each retelling. Some claimed the mountain had wept when the pedestal shattered. Others swore they'd seen Torin's arrowhead turn to starlight in a beggar's palm. But in Rivendell's twilight glades, where the last of the elves prepared to sail westward, Lord Elrond would simply smile when asked for the truth. "Legends are mirrors," he'd say, offering no answers, only the quiet certainty that some stories refuse to be pinned down like butterflies in a display case. On clear nights, when the wind carried the scent of blooming willows across the Bruinen, travelers spoke of two shadows moving along the ridges, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other slight, with a quiver at her back and a laugh like water over stones. No one could say for certain if it was them, or merely the longing of a world that still needed its unlikely heroes, but the stars overhead burned steady, undimmed by time or doubt, as if they too remembered the choice that had saved them, not to take, but to release. Not to conquer, but to kneel in the ashes and plant something new. And so the tale lived, not in the grand halls of kings, but in the way a farmer might pause mid-plow to adjust a child's grip on the reins. In the way A stranger's hand would reach out instinctively when another stumbled on the road. The flame was gone, but its heat lingered, not in the roar of a furnace, but in the quiet, stubborn warmth of palms pressed together against the coming dark.